Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the USC School of Architecture and the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture. Welcome to our Fall 2021 Public Event Series. I want to thank Cynthia Pena, our events coordinator, and the Public Events Committee, now chaired by Professor Alvin Huang. And also to introduce later this evening, he'll be joining us later this evening, Professor Jeffrey Von Owen, Associate Director of Undergraduate Programs in Architecture, who will be moderating our Q&A discussion immediately following our lecture this evening. USC Architecture is committed to training architects and design professionals whose inquisitive minds and emerging talents can be put to use for their clients and for the public good. Our collective humanity is enriched at the moment of intentionality, not just at the point of consumption. How intentional we are as designers at the point of conception as to how a space, a city, a site, a project will convey meaning to multiple constituencies who may interact with that creation in the future. Our speaker this evening embodies that ethos. Claire Weiss is an architect and urbanist and a founding principal of WXY Architecture and Urban Design, an award-winning practice based in New York City. With her partners Mark Yost, Lang Pugh, and Adam Lubinsky, Claire focuses on innovative approaches to public space, structures, and cities. Her firm, WXY, has been honored with an Emerging Voice Award from the Architectural League of New York in 2011, the New York State Firm Award of the Year by the American Institute of Architects in 2016, and was recently named as one of the world's most innovative architecture firms in 2019 by Fast Company. In addition, they've won numerous awards from the AIA New York, and the APA. Some recent and ongoing work in New York City includes the redesign of Astor Place, the Spring Street Sanitation Garage, the redesign of Rockaway Boardwalks, Battery Park's Sea Glass Carousel, a design to better accommodate both pedestrians and elevated trains in Harlem, a study of Brooklyn's growing commercial tech sector, the Brooklyn Tech Triangle, the East River Blueway Plan, a pilot project for the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Rebuild by Design initiative. These are just some of the amazing projects that are happening in her office. Also with Andrea Woodner, Claire co-founded the Design Trust for Public Space and is currently on faculty as a visiting critic of urban design at Cornell's College of Architecture, Art and Planning in New York City. Claire received her professional degree from the University of Toronto with honors and her master's in architecture from Yale University. On a personal note, I remember being on committees when I lived in New York State for funding of grants to emerging talented architects and artists in New York, and really valued Claire's perspective and intellectual generosity in that function, as well as her other nonprofit and professional endeavors. So it's really a pleasure to welcome her to USC Architecture. So please join me in welcoming Claire Weiss to USC Architecture this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton, and thanks to everyone. I'm going to now, hopefully I can do this, share my screen. Looking for the share thing. Now maybe that's something that was on before that's not here. Let me escape.
Should be right at the bottom of the screen. It's
Oh,
a green box.
Thank you. You know, all the practicing in the world. Good evening. I want to start my talk with two paradigms. Clearly, the man-made and the organic. I think that when we talk as architects about where ideas come from, we have to think a little bit about what our own preconceptions are. And for me, the idea that somehow what we make and what things we have control over and things we don't have control over. The idea that they're diametrically opposed is something to be questioned and queried. And that's really that prompt. Number one started my practice going, but when I read about the lecture series, really questioning the role of design and creative, the creative capital of architects in things that happen in cities and happens to people, I wanted to introduce my talk with a couple of ideas that I've come to think are actually true. And one of them is that public space is big. It's not only a big idea, but there's actually a lot of it. Maybe one of the problems is that the places where the public owns things, they share things, are actually really complicated, and they've been made complex over many, many years. And then the final thing is that neighborhoods, not just specific neighborhoods, but anything called a neighborhood or a community, that really they're the things that are of the highest value, valuable over a single project anytime. And so I wanted, as I put together this talk, I started to realize that maybe one of the central ideas is that the projects we have a chance to design and make, that there are many more people that get to know cities by the actual staging and making of these projects. So this is a bridge that took many, many years to achieve in Lower Manhattan. But if you look at all of the people, both offsite and onsite, it took to stage putting a bridge up for 2 days. These were many people who may or may not have realized that this is a neighborhood where people live, work, and play, and they were part of something. The other kind of issue about architecture is that it lands somewhere and it's sited. In the case of the bridge, which is sort of could be seen as a standalone project, I guess I want to prove that no project actually ever stands alone in terms of scale or time. So this is a project that all of its water is collected into a rain garden. The rain garden happens to be in the center of a highway. And that as a stitch, even though there was a lot of restrictions, that especially during COVID, that the redundancy of having another way to cross proved extremely valuable. And so maybe it's really not about the shape and design of the bridge, but the idea that we can add things to cities that not only have a utility, but allow people to be in a different place, to experience a neighborhood they either live in or a neighborhood they've never been in, but are walking to apply for a job, taking someone to school, that you have a chance through the design of public space to create a meaning that you have no control over. You have no control over the interpretation of what you design. This was especially true in a project that I want to take a little bit longer to talk about because it's not a project. It's actually a circumstance that allowed us to work on a series of projects that in a way have become connected. And I'm just going to show some video here. If I can get it started. I'm going to try again and show this video of really before Sandy. This is kind of, home citizen video of the Rockaway Boardwalk, kind of the day Sandy hit. So it was really windy and someone went out there and they started taking this, and as you can see, it's not that attractive a place. And then here, kind of the hurricane starting up, there's a lot of flooding. There's really, the beach has changed. And what I want you to notice in this instance is that these people are who our clients are on the project that I'm showing you. The project that I'm going to show you first is called Rise. It's a youth corps founded in the Rockaways to try and see if um, in environmental jobs and job training, if you can interest youth in the neighborhood in actually training to be scientists, but also training to be horticulturists and managers. And this is more kind of sandy footage. Again, all of this video and pictures were taken by various people at Rise over the years. And actually, there's been a number of architects, doctors, and park rangers that have come through this program. And this is pretty recent footage in the winter. Okay, this is a project that will be an environmental center for them. But the most important part of this is, so the project, the RISE project, is a planning project. And it's a project that is, in a sense, putting out a new way to do, put a youth workforce development model by essentially engaging with younger people for them to set up a model that the Science Foundation, Federal Science Foundation, can give to other people in the country who want to start similar programs to this. And so it was really funded out of National Science Foundation funding. And ultimately, the report is a how-to manual. And I think one of the most important things that came out of the process was that the recommendation that anyone who wants to start a program like this in vulnerable areas across the country actually start with a manifesto. So this manifesto, which is part of the report, was the 12 points. And you can kind of read some of them, but one of the ones that about how younger people can set the rules by which environmental jobs programs and how they will maintain their open spaces. So going to the last set of the rules, there's 14 of them. I think what's really interesting is, had these rules existed when we started the reconstruction of the boardwalk, would we have done this project differently? So you guys get to judge. Before we got to work with RISE, there were some younger people who had started dune restoration. So when we got selected by the engineers to join their team and ultimately selected, we suggested that the project not focused on wood boards, but focus on the dunes. And so before it, you could figure out how to phase it, you had to consider not only the view from the water, but how the rest of the peninsula that didn't have the advantage of having the boardwalk, which is to your left, why would they want to participate in something if it wasn't in their backyard? And I think that's a kind of critical question in any project that has longer value, is why would anyone beyond people whose self-interest is to have a project? So I think that deep problem about what other can projects actually expand to other interests than the project itself, meant that we got the funding to do a plan for the whole peninsula. Kind of meant that what we rendered didn't look like typical renderings. This is a rendering basically to show people what their pretty ordinary situation would look like on the boardwalk, you know, for people living in ground floor apartments, and how it might or might not protect them. So not very glamorous. Equally, you know, in these meetings, we try to figure out a way to show how the areas on the bay side, not connected to the boardwalk, but on the bay, we're going to benefit from the larger public space approach. And that's really true of trying to create a connected path along the bay. Doesn't look like the boardwalk. So the example I'm showing you of this is, here's the rendering that we eventually got to, but here's the reality today. I took this last weekend, that ultimately the boardwalk also benefits the parks and streets along it. It's not disconnected. And that, had we had the set of principles from RISE starting this, it might have been a lot easier to have made assumptions that took much longer to get everyone to agree to. So the youth of Rise who are trying to set a national model that they can codify about how you put a youth jobs corps together, live in a world where actually there's huge numbers of dunes to take care of, versus when they started, there was almost no dunes left. And, the kinds of choices that we went through at the time are pretty much written into their references about asking people meaningful questions. So in this case, we knew that people did not want it to look like a sidewalk. So part of the design impulse to create this boardwalk out of concrete that didn't look like a sidewalk was to do shaped planks and to spell out Rockaway out of big precast planks. So in the end, it is a system, it's an engineered system. It has rules and it can be quantified and explained, but really it isn't something that is rigid. So, being a place to put your towel down, or kind of a place that people can interpret different ways. I think it has turned out that the system of kind of expanding landings of steps enough that people could occupy them has resulted in the kind of social and cultural collisions and listening to each other, especially during COVID. People had to be outside. So they did spend a certain amount of time kind of at least observing each other. And there's also and here it is last weekend, equally people continue to use furniture as furniture, but they also use it as props for holding up things. And the amount of surfing, I know that California, you guys have way better surfing, but the surfing due to our hurricanes in New York lately has been unbelievable, apparently. And this boardwalk also kind of posited an idea about how this was done around the same time, which is that, if you provided really attractive, top-lit, natural light, yet, not too much glass. The Parks Department in New York City won't let you use glass, by the way, for anything. And made space for shade off the boardwalk, people would figure out a way to use it. So what I tell people, I have no pictures of this, but what's happened with this porch was it was supposed to be an environmental classroom like the one I showed you of the rendering, but actually it's turned into kind of an evening kind of party gathering place. And they have pop-up DJs, and the park rangers are concerned, but actually no one lives right around here, so it's a perfect place and no one shuts it down. The other reality is that, of what we design is there's no beach right now in many places. So the boardwalk structure is actually exposed in a way that I certainly didn't predict, that the railing was going to end up literally preventing people from falling off. And so when you looked at what the value of what you were thinking and what ideas you had about, whether people would use the mound for concerts, or whether if you did a shade structure and made it look like a stage, would it work? You take pictures like this, with your photographer as an architect in ideal light. But just going back there last weekend, it may not be the same idealized architectural photograph, but there's no concert happening here. For some reason, people do apparently just show up and have their own spontaneous events. So I want to kind of move on to the subject of garbage, actually, as another, not only employer, but kind of an aspect of cities. So this does have some sound, so you can enjoy how many cars we have on the West Side Highway. This is a project I won't go into in any depth. It's to say it's connected to other parts of the city in a way that people who enjoy walking by the salt shed or seeing this building don't really imagine. And that's because New York City's neighborhoods, you can see Hunts Point way up there at the top, used to, certain neighborhoods carry the burden of all of the recycling and other waste in New York City. And the attempt through policy has been to share the burden. Now, that has happened, and we are carrying our recycling via the water, but that has not solved the fact that most of the waste in New York City, in fact, goes to West Virginia, it goes to New Jersey. It does not stay in New York. We've closed our landfills, which means that New York City has the privilege of being able to have the money to send their garbage out, which is ultimately a kind of, as we all participate in building new buildings in New York, we're simply adding to a problem that is causing essentially all sorts of tertiary effects. You can see there at the bottom that much of our garbage is going in trucks, a little bit barges and rail to other places, and it gets out of New York this way. The burden of this ultimately is on the people whose job it is, again, back to workplace. What I just showed you with the salt shed and the sanitation garage is a workplace for about 400 people. And to the left is how garbage is compressed to be shipped out of New York City. Garbage looks like this. We think about buildings we design, and we don't really think about the waste being stored at the bottom of them like this. I think some of this thinking about waste got me started when I had a chance to collaborate with Meryl Euclides. And Meryl Euclides has been an artist in residence at New York Sanitation Department for a long time. She had a solo show at the Queens Museum and actually managed to find this truck to park it in front of it. And one of her first projects with the Department of Sanitation was to chrome a garbage truck on a regular garbage run. And I think it said a lot of things to a lot of people about how, number one, that waste was them and they were waste, and that our waste system reflected the city. And that really, she started that project when garbage trucks in New York City used to look like this. So that was a long way of saying that one of the neighborhoods that waste is a huge problem in, and that relates to our food shed at the same time, is Hunts Point. Hunts Point is a peninsula in New York City where most of the construction waste historically went, where there are prison barges, where there is the fish market got moved, and the produce market is. And this in red, what's noted here is the Spofford, or was the Spofford Juvenile Jail. And it got closed finally after a lot of pressure from the Hunts Point community, many of whom had suffered by being in this jail as teenagers. It got closed by the community, and the community, after a number of years, asked to be part of the redevelopment. And so I'm putting this project in as an example because it was done, pushed by the community to be a site, taken on by the city to go through a regular affordable housing process. And then right at the last minute, I think someone, maybe from the city or from the community, asked for the request for proposals to consider including work. And so this is actually a picture of Hunts Point from the roof of the first phase of the buildings, which are just being completed now, one of which is a new ground up manufacturing building. So you can see that the site plan is the reverse of the jail. What was the jail buildings, those big T-shaped configuration with courtyards where you could monitor people who were incarcerated, it's being moved to a series of buildings that is part of the neighborhood. So Casanova Street goes through, Barretto Street goes through, and Burnett Place goes through. So the core idea of this project is that whether it's 200 units of 100% affordable housing, each building needed to have a workplace associated. And in addition, the corner of the site should provide new space for local entrepreneurs that had never been able to even get in to other spaces in the neighborhood or had been renting for a long time and never been able to own their own space. So you can see, though, that like many neighborhoods in other cities, this is a really hilly neighborhood. So this series of public spaces or blocks are pedestrian priority, except for the top one are pedestrian spaces, but they're all like different kinds of step streets. They are really a kind of hilly topography. The materiality of this was really tied into the issue of, even though this was going to be built by a group of 3 developers, a not-for-profit, a community group called the Point Community Development Corporation, they knew that if you commission a design, there was going to be some similarities. So what we tried to do is set a kind of material template to try and encourage some amount of differentiation. And what I would also say is that there are 2 architects, ourselves and Victor Body Lawson, who's done a lot of work in New York around housing, and Elizabeth Kennedy, landscape architect. So really having a number of firms involved has also added to the idea that it's not supposed to look like a campus. This is the food production building, although I think a knitting manufacturer is also going to move in here. It's under construction. This is where there will be an incubator kitchen for smaller companies. And this is, I think, where the knitting company is going to go. Sort of want to point out that all projects in neighborhoods, even when neighbors and stakeholders are coming from the community, are a source of mystery to people. And I think one of the problems in how architecture is produced is that there's a kind of mystery involved in terms of who's doing it. And I would say this is the only project I've worked on in terms of buildings in a long time, other than other projects in Hunts Point, like a school and a boat building, where people did want to see the buildings demolished. And the fact that there's a kind of hole there waiting for the next phase is actually considered a sort of point of community pride, which is really, it may seem odd, actually. I want to talk through, one of the themes of this has been design, what relates architectural and creative production to change and to the kind of change that we would all feel benefits long-term, many people, not just a few. So this is it's a project I call D15, but it's really the first project that we were able to complete and collect data on New York City school system. In this case, it's a middle school and in a pretty big area. You can see some things from the process. I'm going to do a quick piece of video so you get a sense of the number of people involved in trying to understand why they had to choose, why their kids had less choice in going to school or too much choice going to school, and what all of this meant to people. So it involved pretty much a year of data collection and work, many languages. It's a very, very large area. And in the end, not only it was the same way as we do kind of bespoke solutions in architecture, this was very much a solution that worked for District 15. I think the question is, if you're trying to answer, is it possible to create real choice and to really take and to create diversity in schools? Can you do that beyond one community that was a particular way? So that's an open question. So I want to explain a little bit how these projects are built. So New York City, when you walk around the streets, particularly in Brooklyn, it seems like an incredibly diverse place. When you go to school in New York as a kid, it's not a particularly diverse place. And you can see by the data here that this is called, we term this, or really the whole process ended up terming this racial isolation. In the end, there's a kind of technique and really a way of describing how do you take all of these factors and understand what's going on instead of doing kind of blanket solutions, and that's a dissimilarity index. And that's the way we use to kind of judge the results. And I'm going to show you where D15 is. And so D15 has, and if any of you go visit New York City, you'll know that Red Hook, Sunset Park, and Park Slope are all very, very different places. Well, they all happen to be in the same school district. And they have extremes of income. And that really leads to actually a great deal of disparity in the choices people feel they have, whether they have to commute longer, whether their kid only got in one school or another. And that kind of leads to what kind of choices, what kind of levers and strategies do you have? Like in something that's purely a physically based problem, you think, do we build a wall? Do we take a wall down? These are very similarly kind of ideas that actually exist when you think about schools. But it comes down to something that's called a screen, which is what are the things like noting kids' absences or late things or taking tests. Can you analyze whether those screens are actually causing problems rather than solving problems? And really the assignment policies or screens, once you analyze them, you start realizing, and the teachers realized this all along, but parents started realizing that in fact, the schools were imposing things on them that they carried as a burden. And so from that came a process that was established based on these three principles: recognizing and nurturing previous efforts and partnerships, including many people at the table who were not included in things like community boards or school board districts, and really balancing equity and democracy, choice. And so the community really served as the foundation for what now is a process the rest of New York City's middle schools are signing up to go through. And through that, there was a series of recommendations around not only how people came out in terms of income or race or gender, but also physical and other disabilities that students really and parents were challenged by. And this has resulted, even through COVID, in moving the school district in a different way. And, there's a bunch of media out there on this. There was a huge amount of opposition. We got a lot of threats in the office about even doing this work. But in the end, I think it was seen as a kind of breakthrough. This kind of gives you a little bit more of a spatial sense of kind of how we mapped this. And, I'm showing this in particular for kind of students where you have to always, sometimes in projects, you think, I'm going to question the border. In this case, we could not question the border we were working in, but we were able to question everything within that border. And so, in a sense, I find it really interesting because the work I showed you before was trying to, in a sense, look at kind of really zooming out and wondering the effects of those buildings or bridges at communities beyond themselves. In this case, there was already a border and a district. We had to try and find the diversity of the context within it. I also think that this question in particular kind of stayed with me throughout this process, which was one of the comments we got over and over again about not needing to, a parent not wanting to send their kid out of the district to get the services they need, and if you had special needs. And that really kind of helped get solved through this process. And the last point I think I need to make about this is, in parallel, we had an opportunity. One of the biggest employment is the Brooklyn Army Terminal is in Sunset Park. Sunset Park is a huge employer, mostly hospitals, and it's the bit now where all the testing is done for COVID, incidentally, but it also has a lot of other kinds of manufacturing. And in parallel, back to the public space part, this is what Brooklyn Army Terminal looked like. We went through a process of kind of reintroducing a public realm approach to Brooklyn Army Terminal, and a kind of working on a graphic identity that put both the buildings and what happened in them and people back in the center. And I think this has resulted, even though it's not a traditional park, in the ferry to Sunset Park and Brooklyn Army Terminal's spaces becoming spaces where people who work there feel they can bring their families to. And so, in a sense, I'm going to end, that way we'll have time for questions, with this, really this kind of perspective, which is, this is a list of all of our clients and people who were architects at WXY just in the last 4 years. And so I'm going to stop sharing so you can see me. So really, one of the issues about work is to think about affordability, and gentrification, not only about property values where people live, but ultimately the biggest dilemma and question that we all have is, what will work be in the future? How will work be affordable? How will we know we will have work? And I think in reflecting on the issue of citizen architect that you're all working on, it seemed to me that the architecture profession produces a huge amount of participants in the work of building cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was wonderful. Appreciated that lecture. And I'm Jeffrey Van Ooyen, professor at the USC School of Architecture, in conversation with Claire to have a little bit of a follow-up discussion about the lecture, and to also help to talk about any of the questions that you all might have. Claire, thank you again for that presentation. I'm curious to know a little bit more about this idea that you left us with regarding work and the future of work. So one of the questions that we had from the audience from Daniel Silva, he writes, in terms of resiliency, how might the global pandemic transform the urban environment, and what could be some of the potential resiliency strategies for it? I wonder, as we think about work and resilience and kind of post-pandemic life, how you imagine the relationship between work, housing, and let's throw resiliency in there. How might that impact the way we develop urbanism, 2021 onward?
The concept of the 15-minute city that really Paris has taken real leadership on, but I think for good reason, it's caught on. I've been really taken with the idea that it's not the 15-minute city, but a city of many 15-minute cities. And I think this applies equally to Los Angeles as it does to New York.
Sure.
And in what I tried to show in Spofford was an idea of how do you balance buildings that could have both workplaces, living, and other things that's even urban, serious urban farming, that they can stand alone in crises. This is where I get to the resiliency, that you have a way as a building to have running water, to take care of people, to interact between neighbors, because people don't, you can, understand a handful of people in your building, and many buildings, people are still socially isolated. But I don't think that's enough. I think that beyond the building, there needs to be an understanding of streets and blocks as being somehow connected to buildings in a way that people, and again, it's through public space, that people can feel maybe that there are some indoor spaces that actually they have access to, maybe the way libraries have been traditionally, but potentially there's new kinds of empty spaces that can be used, especially for people that who may not have housing, who may not have a place to shower. So I think it really changes the paradigm of how public space and privately owned buildings are going to kind of create value for each other in the future.
Right. That shared public-private relationship, and it seems like community amenities that are accessible to folks who might not otherwise have ownership or have access to amenities through ownership is what I'm hearing.
Well, clearly New York has less of a sort of closed garden space paradigm than many other cities.
Right.
So when I showed Spofford, that's like a courtyard. The courtyard doesn't have gates on it. I mean, the idea is that it belongs to the whole community.
Yes.
But it benefits from people having eyes on it.
Right.
In most cases, most buildings that have courtyards are very much that courtyard is only for the building itself. And I'm not saying that's wrong or right, but there's potentially kind of, I think the development of both, of public courtyards and private courtyards, so you have enough of both, I think are going to be important ideas in the future.
Absolutely. I think that's something that we're really focused on at USC in terms of housing instruction, and our leading practitioners, folks like Lorcan Hirlehi or Larry Scarpa and Angie Brooks and such, they're really focused on these, creating amenity spaces within these private developments that are also shared with the city. And I think that's a huge and important thing looking forward to housing. So
I think the issue is who funds the actual, employment generation parts of those amenity spaces. So
Yes.
One of the challenging things with that industrial building, and getting a city to build a new industrial building doesn't happen very often. And in this case, and really most businesses put up, unless they can afford it, with very bad space.
Yeah.
And so finding a way to produce a new building, level floors and HVAC. In the case of, it's called 1A, it doesn't have a name yet, but it has its own biodigester. It's a zero waste building. Like, and who takes care of all of that for the benefit of tenants who are producing tamales and, cake pops and things that the margins are very small on,
Right.
really does require, a public contribution. And I think, just like a library, I think we're starting to see in New York that the contribution of the public, Brooklyn Army Terminal, Brooklyn Navy Yard, to the production of buildings for work is something that should be a public asset. And that's really that, and having that associated with affordable housing means that someone's commute to work might be 5 minutes. It might keep someone employed longer and not quitting at the age of 55 or 60 because they, it might keep their lifestyle more affordable. But it requires subsidy of the space itself so that companies can afford it.
That's really exciting, and it makes a lot of sense. I'd like to flip over to another question we have from a Professor Rob Barry at the School of Architecture. He says, "Thanks for a wonderful talk. Given your point that we as architects can never fully control how our buildings and public spaces are ultimately used, how can a community-driven process balance immediate needs and desires with unforeseen but exciting possibilities?"
Well, I want to give a shout out to Rob Barry, former New Yorker, and who I had the pleasure of working with at WXY a number of years ago, and now teaches architecture and has a practice. I think that, to answer that, I think there's a lot of good examples in street installations, in kind of making stuff in public spaces that involve a number of people who live and work. And there's some great examples of it in LA too. Even, we call them parklets, but, street seats.
Yeah,
where
Rob has done some in LA. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that all of a sudden the value for way more people than a private car parked there is immediately gratifying. I consider street seats and parklets one of the most gratifying public space moves in a long time. And I think that's a good example of it. I mean, for the larger policy stuff, D15 was interesting because even though the process took a year, changing a rule means you just have to do it right before people apply for schools. And within 2 or 3 months, you can start seeing the results.
Mm-hmm.
So planners do have a somewhat of an advantage over architects because they can do engagement around certain topics and things can change much more quickly than the bricks and mortar side of things. And so for me, it's kind of tantalizing to think urban design, the design of public space, but really is a bridge between both and can use the tools of both.
There's so much in your lecture, and I don't want to. I'd like to cover a few broad topics before we have more audience questions. But I was really taken with your resiliency planning for Rockaway and for the coast there. I have several friends working on projects there. Walter Meyer at Local Office Landscape Architecture and other folks who are doing work in the Rockaway and the Dune development. And there are really important questions that I think Rockaway begins to ask on behalf of much broader spectrum of coastal questions throughout the US and the world. How we develop coastal areas when we know there is sea level rise, when we know that there are these superstorms and flooding that are happening more and more, when we're trying to negotiate between property rights and ideas of fixed delineated property on a fluid coastal area that's moving and changing, where certain lots are gaining land and others are eradicated. The idea of investing infrastructure to these places, to protecting neighborhoods in them, to creating equitable access to the coast and access to coastal use. So again, this public-private question. What do you think your work and your research and the whole Rockaway project is will be able to contribute to a larger discussion about resilience, coastal resilience?
Well, I think that one of the tendencies we have is to think that all solutions are kind of end up in a building, right? Do we
Yeah.
raise something? Do we lower it? Do we build a wall? Do we not build a wall? In barrier islands, where you can really see the drastic change, nothing works. So no wall will ever be 100%. The island itself is moving.
Yeah.
No raising something on stilts. So you really have to turn around and ask kind of a different question, which is, why are we here? And the we varies a lot. If the we is a surfer who may not have a lot of money, but they are more mobile, they could move to somewhere else, right? Then it's a different conversation. If it's someone in a nursing home, it's someone that's a house or a Section 8 apartment where that's their only easy kind of place to be right now, and they're in an isolated circumstance, then you have two choices, which is improve in place and make sure people have not only the warnings, but actually you're giving ways for them during a storm to actually evacuate easily. Right. And that's where, the advocacy and the planning and getting a ferry out there, the subway isn't work, like having all of these layers, the Dutch call them, they call them kind of layers of resiliency, but basically you need redundancy. And you need to know that you've left a lot of vulnerable people without many choices. And this is really true in a number of cities. And that gets me back to the public responsibility on building great libraries and building more swimming pools and building great public spaces in those vulnerable areas so there could be greater access to resources. So younger people are engaged with the questions of, we live here in a vulnerable place and we're part of raising awareness of it. And I think that every place is vulnerable right now. It's just that barrier islands are starkly more vulnerable.
It makes a lot of sense. So if you were to build some of this infrastructure and create that in these places, in a way, you are also, you're doubling down on the future in that place and doubling down on the community in that place and saying, we know this is a vulnerable place, and but there are many reasons why this should remain as a community. There's many reasons why this should, folks should continue to inhabit this particular geographic region. And
that flies in the face of most beach scientists and other people who are like, just move people out. And they're absolutely right. They're basically retreat is the rational answer. But cities will have to provide for communities as a whole to transition and feel good about their choices in retreating.
Yeah.
Is the only, I think, equitable way.
Yes.
to adapt, because those people and those communities are there because public policy put them there in the first place, whether it was by redlining or Robert Moses deciding the New York Aquarium and a bunch of social housing were all going to go in Coney Island and the Rockaways.
Yeah.
So it's, in a sense, our policies put people in certain, so really, I think doubling down on investing in not only a process, but the place itself should be part of adaptation.
In a lot of ways, it makes sense in that we, if retreat is the only option, I mean, there's a lot of climate change coming toward humanity, and retreat may not be the only option. Is really this adaptation to different weather patterns, to what are going to be long periods of drought or wildfire or flooding or whatnot. It's it's not just the coast, or it's not just these high fire danger areas or something. It's in places that haven't seen this sort of volatile environment are now seeing that more volatile environment throughout the world.
Yeah, and I think the depletion of, habitats for, whales, manatees, dolphins in these coastlines, you're seeing a lot of loss. In Florida, you're seeing the loss of seagrass, which is causing manatees to starve. The other weekend, when I went and took those pictures, for the first time in my life, I saw a whale, like literally 300 feet, 400 feet off the boardwalk. And before you have not seen whales that far in, and it has to be because whether food or other reasons. So I think the things are changing at a much faster speed than people expected them to, because things had been changing for a long time, but it was so slow that none of us noticed, or really our policies didn't reflect it, maybe.
Right. Well, there also seems to be something, I think, optimistic about your work, in the sense that traditionally there's been a lot of environmental thinking about architecture and urbanism, where, okay, these are the urban areas and these are the wild areas, and we separate them, and the people in the urban areas do the things that they're going to do in the urban areas and destroy nature and that, but we're going to preserve these other things, these other wild things, without so much emphasis on how to live in wild places, how to relate to nature, whether it be something very obvious like a coastline, or in a city, or the way that we deal with what was heat island effect, or deal with energy collection, or deal with farming, or deal with these other things where we create environments that are good for insects or good for birds or whatnot. And it seems to me that you have an optimistic viewpoint about the relationship between humanity and nature in that sense. Going back to your original thesis in the very beginning of the talk, your original point in the talk about what's made by people and what isn't.
Yeah, I am really optimistic about building natural systems, actually. That like what we do in architecture can work towards supporting natural systems in every case, not only standalone. Like, people were disappointed in New York City in particular with green infrastructure for a long time, because they couldn't maintain it, or because it took work to maintain it.
Right.
But in places with really, it was solving a lot of other problems, but garbage collected in it, other stuff. But actually, it with a tiny bit of maintenance, that you may not have gotten the same amount of safety. You may not have lowered the risk in terms of deluge rains the engineers wanted, but actually you increase the habitat by an extreme amount. But New York City wasn't counting bugs and butterflies and other things as part of the value proposition for green infrastructure.
Right.
But you could really see through Walter Meyer's work and various other people's work that it changed the dynamic in those places. People noticed that about the High Line, because they finally got up on it, that Pete Adolph's mix of all those different plant types actually created what felt like an actual wild place up there.
Right. No, it's super exciting. And just on a personal note, I've worked with Walter on a project for coastal dune restoration in Puerto Rico, and some other work I've been doing in the urban wildland interface in Southern California, wildfires and such. I find your work really fascinating in this way. So I'm kind of personally interested in the topic. So I'm enjoying talking to you about this.
Great.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about, to circle back a little bit to these issues when we talk about citizen architect of kind of the, creating more just urban spaces and the work that you're doing in terms of creating access. And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning. And it seems like you've circled back several times to the relationship between housing and schools. And it seems to me that there's a lot of opportunity there to create some of these community amenities through the schools themselves, or through the planning of the schools in relation to community. I wondered if you might talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think one of the big challenges about kids and one of the ways to look at it is there's a number of people who actually don't move around cities in cars. And that's people below the age of 18 and older people who shouldn't be driving anymore. And, a number of people in between, whether you're blind and really driving is not the right thing. And in many, many cities, they're not served by anyone. And yet, from a kind of sustainability point of view, they're actually the good actors in all this. Like, kids are the citizen, they're the citizens that get the highest sustainability grades because they're not using cars.
Right.
So when you think about back to the kind of future of city stuff, when you think about the opportunities of biking to school, right? Or even having schools as being places where they would support kind of workforce development, or they could support active, food production or advocacy, or, an openness to that. It makes a lot of sense in terms of mobility too, because all of a sudden school and living, you don't need a car as much. And that could really lower the effect and the amount of space cars are taking up.
Sure.
I do think the fact that our entire urban environment is designed around cars. So we even have schools that are, in a sense, designed around the car right now in many, many places, even in places like Brooklyn and New York. Where teachers are going to park is like an actual question.
Yeah.
And so schools may be breaking up schools to be even pieces of them where you could walk down the street to take science class and go around the block to take math and actually share a gym with other people might actually be an amazing dream, because it starts opening up the possibility that education is a lifelong thing. Right now, I don't see it as being any more than a theory, but it makes a lot of sense to think about schools as an urban resource, actually.
Well, it certainly worked at Oxford and Cambridge and places like that. But I mean, in terms of when we think about contemporary society, yeah, it's a wonderful idea. It's a really strong idea. I think we're running a little bit short on time. I don't see any new questions cropping up here in our Q&A dialogue box, but I did want to talk, maybe just offer you an opportunity to talk for a moment, especially to some of the women in the audience, some of the folks who are studying architecture and are watching your lecture. And if there's some advice that you might give, particularly to women who are studying architecture now, and maybe how the profession has changed from the time you were in school and starting out in practice to how it is now, and what advice you might give in that regard.
I think one of my kind of strongest pieces of advice is to take seriously what you're doing in school. I think especially when you get to like your final studios, or if there's a studio you take that is on a topic you're completely compelled by, is to really take that on and imagine that there's a reason you're really interested in it. Because strikingly, I'm convinced that the world of practice and what you do in school are not so different than each other. So the things you find interesting in school are the things that you will find interesting in practice, which means that you will want to find a way to work on those problems. So if you make a choice going out of school to ignore the things that you found most compelling in school, I would say you will be less happy than you want to be. And so really my advice is kind of look at the time in school as valuable, because you're getting a lot of content thrown at you and you're generating a lot of content. And some of that content you're generating, you feel personally compelled by. In my case, it was, believe it or not, schools when I was doing my thesis at Yale. And like what makes people design a school a certain way. For other people, it's, thousands of other things. And I think we're brought up in a way that you get, your grades and you do your homework and you walk away from it. And architecture, I think, has a possibility of not being that what you generate while you're having a chance to study is actually the beginning of what you may want to be generating, promoting, or even starting your own organization around when you graduate.
Yeah. So those things that you find some proclivity toward, and that you're doing academically to really try to keep that alive and keep that going and keep building on that interest. And
yeah,
there seems to always be a gap.
Opportunity. I think that's the opportunity of architectural education, and the real advantage is that you're already practicing. You're just practicing in an academic environment. And I think, in a lot of ways, the barriers are not, the societal barriers are there, and the racism is there, but we as architects are actually, and planners and urban designers, there are issues that you're finding now in school that you actually have the means and the voice to do something about. So really, I would say that, you have to decide when. It's up to you to decide when you want to use your voice. But I think my word of advice is know you have one,
Yeah. It makes me think of your fellow alumnus Maya Lin at Yale doing her project for the Vietnam Memorial, and just taking that and saying, this is something that's compelling and important, and I'm just going to push this through and make that happen. And to not let go of that, or to be dissuaded or discouraged by the doubters or whatnot in the process.
Yeah, and I think that's really true of anyone who's come even first, second year in architecture school. Yeah. It's a lot of work to get here. And I think kind of believing that what you're finding and exploring has value is something that's really important.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's exciting that we're doing at USC right now is especially working to align values with, what we're doing in design. and what we're, actually saying that we're working to align, values and positive collaborative work in social justice and multidisciplinary work across landscape and urbanism and architecture, heritage preservation, or heritage conservation, building science, these types of things, and trying to work across these boundaries and say, how can we align those with the values that we hold? And that's what I think is so exciting about your work. And I'm so grateful that you're able to present to us today and share that
Thank you.
with all of us here. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Claire, thank you, Claire, for that clear lecture that really, I think, stitches together. We're in LA, and we talk about creativity and the creative economy and creator economy, and I think it's important. I think you've underscored that it's not, being creative is great, but also the intentionality at the core, the authenticity of the values that you're kind of moving through the work, both the process, who's engaged, not just the output, whether it's exciting, but who's engaged, how it actually moves through, is part of the meaning structure that is going to live and sustain that project as it exists for decades to come. So I think that's evident in all of your work, and I think it's a really important lesson for students. So thank you so much. And as I've said to everybody during COVID, we got to get you to LA in person
Yes.
at some point in the next year when we are back having lectures in person, and get you on some reviews and things like that. So your perspective is really appreciated.
Yeah, would love that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great night. And thanks for coming. Take care.
Take care.